in part.
You want us to save questions till the end?
Yeah, please. And the Climate Change Convention, I've got to tell you, the Climate Change Convention itself is to the same effect. Article 3.3, which is part of the principles in the Climate Change Convention. So it's a non-binding, it's just guidance for action. The parties should take precautionary measures to anticipate, prevent, or minimize the causes of climate change and mitigate its adverse effects. Well, what is solar radiation management but a mitigation of the adverse effects of rising greenhouse gas concentrations by reducing the amount of heat that gets into the system? Where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, which we've been telling people there are with climate change, serious threats of serious or irreversible damage. Lack of full scientific certainty about the solutions, I guess, should not be used as a reason for postponing such measures, including measures to mitigate those risks. Taking into account that policies and measures should be cost effective, just if you needed one other reason to pursue climate engineering. Many of the cost estimates are far lower than the estimates of reducing greenhouse gas emissions through regulation. So what are the options for action that we have? We could have a new treaty. That's my favorite, and I'll tell you why in a couple of minutes. We could have governance within the UN Framework Convention. It's already on climate change. It's already got a governance structure. It's got nearly universal adherence. It has provisions for scientific research and effort. It seems the logical place to govern climate engineering, and many people have advocated that. I don't, and I'll tell you why in brief. First of all, it appears to be dysfunctional. The consensus decision-making process that's used has been, for several years now, an abject failure, or at least that's my view. We've made no progress. The requirement that any decisions that are made have to be adhered to by ratification before they're binding on anyone means that even when we can reach a consensus on something like the Kyoto Protocol, any country that gets cold feet, like the US, can back out. And on the geoengineering point in particular, although NGOs have been calling for the UNFCCC parties in their meetings to say something, anything about this, there's been, as far as I can tell, deathly silence in any official words coming out of the UNFCCC. So I just don't see any hope for that body, though I hope and wish I were wrong. We could have a coalition of the willing. And this is what I fear we'll get, and it's a scary proposition. It will certainly allow research to go ahead, but I do not think that it will address in any way some of the fundamental justice issues involved here that I want to talk about in a minute. And then finally, maybe even more scary, is the prospect that governments will stay out of this entirely in a formal way, and that they will leave it to the industrial, academic, government research complex to decide what to do about this. And the scientists around the world talk to each other, they work together, they secure funding together, and they will pursue this, if not stopped. And if I don't want to stop them, but I would love to regulate them, because I fear that scientific curiosity and scientific hubris, being what they are, they're just too powerful forces to leave they are too powerful for us to leave the regulation of planet-changing forces in their hands and say, you guys decide what to do. However we govern geoengineering, whatever structures we use, whether it's a new treaty or the UNFCCC or a coalition of the willing, I think, for me, the fundamental issue, at least one of them, the one I want to talk about, because I think it's so important, is the issue of environmental justice and how to structure the governance system to promote environmental justice. I'm not confident that this will happen, but I think it's what it should happen. And my research is oriented to trying to figure out recommendations that might help in that direction. What do I mean about environmental justice? Well, I want to start with a quote from the Asilomar Conference. This was the conference of scientists and NGOs and others that advocated proceeding with geoengineering research. The conferees made the point, although they said we should go ahead, that these large-scale experiments will unavoidably carry some risk of harm to some groups. And it's in that context I want to think about the question of justice. And I think it has two components. Component one, if there are benefits and if there are burdens, if there are harms, they should be equitably distributed. We can fight about what equitable means. But I can guarantee you, if we fight about it and argue about it, we will reach a better and more equitable result than if we ignore it. Second, the people, the groups that are facing the risk of harm ought to be allowed to participate meaningfully in the decisions that are going to impose harm upon them. That's what I mean by environmental justice. And just stating it, I think, I hope, makes you realize how difficult it will be to achieve. Even domestically, I would venture to say 90% of the time within our own country, if an activity has serious environmental harm, that it's going to be structured so that that harm falls on the poor and the powerless, not on you and me, because we know how to fix it, but on the people who don't know what to do about it. Internationally, that problem is even more severe. And that's because I think of two fundamental barriers to environmental justice in the international arena that are structural, that are built into the system, and therefore have to be thought about seriously and addressed directly. One barrier is political. It's the nature of the sovereign state system. The sovereign state system is fundamentally poorly designed to deal with situations where the action within one country has deleterious effects somewhere else. And the reason it's poorly designed is this. I'm sure you've all heard that, right? All politics are local. When our political leaders make a decision, I'll exaggerate a little, but I don't think much, they do not give a whit what happens to somebody who's not a voter. Right? And if we're talking about geoengineering, disrupting the monsoon in India by the experiments we commit in the US, well, our political leaders are unaccountable to the people whose lives they're disrupted. They don't care about them or think about them because they don't vote. And they're beholden to an insular electorate that also, I have to tell you, by and large, and I'm guilty of this as anyone, cares mostly about how things affect themselves and not very much about how things affect someone else. So let's suppose, just do a thought experiment with me. Our geoengineers say, we think that the sulfate aerosol in the atmosphere solution is going to work. We want to try an experiment to see what happens. We also think we know, because we've seen how volcanic eruptions disrupt weather patterns, that if we inject the sulfate aerosols here, they're going to cause a failure of the rainfall there. And we have our choice. We can inject them here, and the rain's not going to fall all summer over the Corn Belt. Or we can inject them here, and the rain's not going to fall all summer over Ethiopia. Where are they going to inject the sulfate aerosols? Assuming this conversation is taking place with U.S. politicians behind closed doors. I can tell you, they're not going to inject them where they wreck the lives of their constituents. And it's a fundamental problem with the international system. It's a fundamental problem with the sovereign state system, that the people that the problems have gotten so big that these major decisions have profound impacts on people who have no voice. It is, how would I say it? It's a frightening modern version of taxation without representation. So that's the first problem, structural problem with the international system. The second problem is that the system is weak. We wouldn't really have to worry that much about politicians only being beholden to their own constituents and not caring about the impact they have if the international system was able to enforce the rule that you shall not cause significant transboundary harm. That is, if the international system had a strong enough central government or a strong enough and well enough honored judiciary that if harm was caused to Ethiopia by sulfate aerosol experiments in the U.S. had to pay compensation. If we had that kind of system, then political leaders would be forced by the risk of paying compensation in the future to take into account the consequences that they might impose on others. But we don't have a strong enough international system to do that. In fact, the system has really, there's no evidence that it is functionally capable of imposing liability for transboundary environmental harm. The Chernobyl explosion in Russia is the prime example that caused huge problems of transboundary radiation. Millions of dollars at least of damage to other countries. No country made a demand on Russia to compensate, many of them saying because they didn't think they had a legal basis to do so. Even if they had, they probably recognized that they would not recover. There is no international court with compulsory jurisdiction. The International Court of Justice has jurisdiction over those countries that have consented to its jurisdiction. They can withdraw their consent, and some, like the United States, have. So it's a fundamentally weak legal system, and that makes the system unable to ensure that those externalities are addressed. In the international system, the polluter does not pay, even though the principles say that the polluter should pay.